Okay, I don't know if this is part 2 or if this is its own thing. I have no idea. Or if it's just a continuation of what we were talking about. I don't know. I think I might make it a part 2 just because there's so many things here, and I do think it's kind of valuable, at least for me, to look back on and not feel rushed. Let's talk about something that is interesting as hell called social proof. This is one of the, what do you call it, weapons of influence, quote unquote. This is one of the autonomic kind of things, but it's called social proof. Truths are us. But yeah, social proof, the quick TLDR is when we observe others on what to do in a given situation that we do not know what to do in. So if we are unaware of what to do in a certain situation, we will look to others around us. Granted, it's not even just that. It's when we are in a situation, we often look to others to see how to react or how to best do it. A good kind version of this is simply like laugh tracks, something also called clackers back in the opera days. But basically, they're people who simulated laughter, like encore, stuff like that. And even though people can obviously know that like laugh tracks are like kind of annoying in TV, the TV producers know that if you hear laughter, there's a higher probability that you'll laugh because of social proof. You'll look to your environment to see how best to react. Now, something to consider is you are more likely to use social proof when it is someone who is similar to you. So if you were like lost in a city that you didn't know much about, you wouldn't look to like a kid running down the street, frolicking somewhere. You wouldn't look at him as what to do. But if it was a person that was your age, wearing the same clothing as you, you probably looked to that person and what to do, maybe even ask them what's going on or where to get directions, etc. And again, social proof is made even more powerful when you are in an unfamiliar situation or location. So when you have little data to go on, you will look to how things should be reacted in a certain given situation. Okay? Again, kind of what this is playing off of is something called social evidence. Again, we'll look at how to react based on how everybody else is reacting. One of the best examples in this book, and kind of terrifying in a degree, is kind of the darker side of social proof called social ignorance. Or, it's not called social ignorance, but it's a pluralistic ignorance, I think is what it's called. But basically, there was a story back in New York City, back in the day, which essentially had this woman who was for half an hour chased and stabbed repeatedly in a half an hour time in the middle of a block that she lived on with her neighbors watching for the entire 30 minutes. Only then an hour later, someone finally phoning the police, and of course, calling the police to the situation. So people were throwing around a bunch of stuff back in the day, basically saying that like human beings in cities are demonstrous, human beings are getting emotionally detached, people being crueler. But yeah. And this plays off of this idea. The big takeaway of this kind of situation plays off of this idea. Let me ask you a question. If something to you happened where you had a stroke, you had a heart attack, you maybe just passed out, whatever could happen, maybe you got shot, stabbed or something, do you think your odds of getting help would increase with more people around or decrease? Shockingly, and the evidence is fucking clear, is that if you have more people around you and you are in need of help or are in some sort of problem, basically more people around you means less help. The reason why, something called pluralistic ignorance or social ignorance. What that means is that basically people will obfuscate load or cause for everyone around you. So say if there's a bunch of people in like a New York City runway, and they walk past a unconscious body on the ground, and they look around and they see that nobody is reacting. The odds are people will just keep walking by. They're like, oh, maybe it's a homeless man sleeping or something, and you're like, walk right on by. That's a dead person. You just walk by a corpse. But you looked at everyone else around you and you see nothing. And the funniest thing is that others are doing the same thing to you. They're looking at the same corpse and they're looking at others and they're seeing that no one has a reaction and they're going. Now, here's another thought process that can also take into consideration. People will obfuscate responsibility onto others. So a person's walking down the street, they see something looking sketchy, and the guy says, okay, well, there's so many people here, somebody else will handle it. I have a meeting or a job I have to go be at, so I'm going to go. They'll handle it. But all that does is let that person walk off and that other people see him and think, oh, this must not be a problem. So then they walk off and then the other people see them walking away. And then this just detonates into a triggering effect that no one gets help. This person is in need of help and no one rationalizes it. The other thing is that when you're in a city or you're in an environment where things are constantly happening, and you need social ignorance or pluralistic ignorance, I guess, which basically is the offloading of data. So if you're living in a city and you're hearing screams, cracks, and crackles all over all the time, unless you want to live your entire life in fear of investigating all these sounds and these things, you have to offload data a lot of the time. Oh, that gunshot was probably just a car backfiring, and sometimes it is. I mean, oh, that screaming was just a premarital dispute, in which if I were to get involved, I would get yelled at as well, and they wouldn't want me there. That weird like sound. Oh, that's just a homeless man outside screaming. So you do this naturally. You kind of obfuscate responsibility, so you're not living in terror of what is the worst possible scenario. But that also means when the worst possible scenario happens, you ignore it. Now, this is terrifying and horrifying, and this woman got killed in a horrible way, and that was the thing. The reason why the stabbing went on for such a long time is because the person that was doing the stabbing, the horrible monster, he basically seen that the neighbors' lights were on and they were all watching, so he kept getting scared and walking away, but then coming back to kind of finish the job. And nobody out of all the neighbors or out of all the 30 people watching called it, but again, that's because of this pluralistic ignorance. All of them were interviewed and they were like, I don't know why he didn't do anything. They didn't know what the hell was going on. But it's also because each one of them assumed that another person had already called the police, because of course they did. Who wouldn't? So there's this offloading of responsibility onto the other. So the way you solve this, the way you solve kind of the negative aspect of social proof in regards to like being in trauma or being in crisis, is you give responsibility to the individual. And there's great examples of like this in the book, where basically a person got into a car crash on the middle of a highway. He knew a lot about social psychology, so of course he immediately opened up the door, even though his leg I think was broken, and he kind of got his head out of the door a little bit and started pointing to cars passing by. And just by pointing at one car, immediately that car he pointed at slowed down, sat parked in thing, and started helping. And he literally said, you call the police, you go check on the other guy who's in the other wrecked car, and you come help me. And when you do that, when you point at someone and say, you in the blue shirt, you in the red shirt, it's not that human beings are cruel. It's just that humans don't know they're being called upon, and humans have an innate ability to offload responsibility. So if you say, no, if I die, it's on you. You go call the police. Not him, you. And people, again, in every example in the book, seem like they're great at that. Human beings do great with direction and mode, and almost like saying, you're the hero. You're going to call the police. You're going to figure out what's going on. You're going to help me and make sure I don't die. Of course, not doing it in such a belligerent way. But the idea that you basically make someone a candidate for your savior. And you'd be amazed of all the stories. And I've also seen this in my daily life of how so many people will actually own up to the responsibility, especially in a crisis situation, if you say it's on your shoulders. Because no one wants to fuck up in this way, especially in a crisis where you're having a stroke or you're having this or that. So that's how you fix the problem. That's how you don't be the woman who basically got stabbed to death as she was screaming and help. Instead of just saying help, say help person, or help guy in the red shirt, help guy in the window while you're pointing. As you're bleeding out, try to point at a person and say phone the police. Or even just saying don't expect others have phoned the police, phone them. And then do that. Stuff like that. So that's what you're supposed to do. If you're ever in a situation where you have a stroke, you have a heart attack, if you can muster any words, point to an individual, not multiple people, an individual, and say you are responsible. You're not. And then it's amazing because when one person is responsible and helps, it's same thing. Social proof works for you in that instance. So people see that somebody is helping somebody who's clearly in distress, and everyone starts helping as well because they see that there's an actual crisis, that there need more help, there need more hands. Everyone should be. This is a real situation. This is not. You can't offload responsibility. So it works for you and not against you. So if you're ever in a crisis situation where you need others' help, call to the individual, not the group. And in calling in the individual, you will usually call everybody to that as well. Because again, people will see that this one person is actually helping you, and I'm sure that person is wanting to not have all the responsibility on him. So he'll start saying, fucking get over here. I'm watch his head or something. I don't know, call the fucking police while I'm holding him, making sure he doesn't bleed out or something. Just because we're on the kind of darker proclivity of social proof, which is not all bad. Again, there's a very lighthearted thing where it's Social proof on the positive side of things is like laugh tracks, how fast to drive. Again, a lot of people will look to people who are in their same lane as how fast to drive through a construction area, stuff like that. So they'll obfuscate responsibility. Bartenders will salt their tip jars so that it makes people seem like, oh, look, people are paying, already tipping this person. That's what I should do too. If you see a barren tip jar, lower odds that you'll feel like you're obligated to give the person a tip. A church donation baskets will also be salted, which is basically just putting in money. Again, in churches also random people will come up and have miracles performed on them. This is more of the con artist kind of thing, but yeah, random assigned people will have people come to them and be like, oh my god, look, so many miracles are happening. God is real. This person is my savior. He has some sort of divine intervention power. And people will believe where otherwise they wouldn't because they are witnessing live something, a miracle, but in reality it's just them planning that ahead of time for that to happen. The other thing that is actually very beneficial for social proof, just to take a break from the darkness, is they had a bunch of kids that were basically socially outcasts in like grade 2 or 3, like younger kids who were socially reserved, we'll say that. So what they did is they basically did a lot of tests, but one of the ones that they did to try to cut out all the fat was they made a 20-minute film. In all instances, they basically showed a kid that was reserved and quiet by himself getting up and walking into the social engagement, whether that's like playing on the playground, playing tag, hide and seek, doing an assignment, doing math, doing writing, whatever, coming into that social encounter to the love and enjoyment of the group. So people basically welcoming in this individual to the group. And they did it with various different types of kids, black, white, tall, small, girls, men, etc. And they did that across the board for 20 minutes. A kid just watched these things happen. And this is utilizing the idea of social proof and imprinting that again, like, look, all of these people, this one person is accepting this person into the group. And the funniest thing is, and it seems like there's a common theme within the book. It sounds kind of weird, but if you're able to manipulate someone or nudge someone in such a way that they start to do a thing, in this instance, the kids starting to be very like sociable, and then you let enough time pass to where they no longer can use an excuse, or they never could use an excuse on why they were doing a certain thing, whether that's like I had an incentive, whether that's I was terrified of what I could if I didn't do it. If they take self-responsibility, their self-image changes and therefore they change. So in this experiment where they got these socially reserved kids to watch this video of kids being social in a way, or a socially reserved kid going into a social environment and then loving them and accepting them, they became way more social. That was the test net result, as well as they got those kids that they came back to the school basically like 2 months later. And they found that not only were the previous socially reserved kids way more social now, but they were leading the charge in sociality and being like leaders of their school, the leaders of the group kind of thing. So their self-image may have started off being nudged in a certain direction, but then their self-image, especially when there's nothing to kind of like sway this, they embody that idea, that ideal, that hope, that thing, which is awesome. So that's a good way to think about all of those kinds of things. Another classic like one-to-one comparison for like business practices that you should look out for is the influencers of Mars coming out, where basically like a person will, like in a TV ad, now it's sometimes like YouTube sponsorships and whatnot, I see this too, where a person will like randomly come out and be like, have you also started having trouble shaving your balls, or like have you also had hair loss? Me too. Like it's like this random guy who's like just like you being like, hey, here's a product that can solve it. I was just like you. So it's an influencer of Mars. Like, where did you come from, and why do you want me to sell this? You're acting like you're giving me a gift when you're clearly paid by a person to say this in the way of you giving me a gift, which makes sense. It makes sense, but it's just kind of a little weird. It used to be done way worse in the past in ads, where they were like, they'd get a celebrity and they'd get random civilians that they found on the street to specifically ask a question like, why is this product so good, Janet, from the TV series I'm watching? And she'd be like, thanks, let's do that. But they would always have like, it was clearly not a civilian, it was clearly a paid actor, but yeah. Influencer from Mars it was called. In regards to social proof, this has an incredibly dark part of it, which we'll talk about now. Werther effect, which is based on a book called The Sorrow of Young Werther. which basically is about a hero who commits suicide. And they found that where the book was published in Europe or in certain places, they had a stupid uptick in suicides that were happened as soon as the book was published. And this book is basically like excommunicated from some countries because it's noted to have this effect. I can only imagine the No Longer Human book, golly. Anyways, one of the things that they also noticed is whenever suicides were reported in the newspapers, wherever the newspapers were posted and seen, there was an uptick in suicides as well as the car crashes and plane crashes. Plane crashes and car crashes can be explained by people trying to collect insurance for their loved ones as they commit suicide. But this is kind of the idea of like the darker side of social proof. Remember the criteria. We look to others to see what is a potential way to solve or to what to do in a certain situation. And the closer we have similarities to them, the closer we feel that connection, as well as also in terms of like musical rock stars. Think of that, where like teenagers who are going through angst and feel sad and like abandoned by the world start to see and really connect with this artist. So when they do take their own life, it only makes it so that they feel like, oh, this is a way that this person handled having these emotions, depression, sorrow, meaninglessness, all these things. This person had the same emotions I did, and one of the ways he did it is by committing suicide. So to them, it makes sense that when you are publicizing this idea of doing this thing, that it is going to increase the consideration and possibility of that being an actual outcome. We see this in a positive light in like sports, or when somebody achieves a certain thing, like within the Olympian stuff, or when someone breaks a new record, that record is almost immediately attained by the previous people also working to that in that same area, whether it's running, whether it's high jump, whatever. Because they show that that's a possibility. There no longer is doubt for that new standard to be reached. It kind of paved the way is what the phrase is. But that's kind of terrifying for things that we see on all of our daily life, where when news coverage about certain things, whether that's serial killers, this is also like the copycat idea too, of like when somebody sees a murder happen and they think, oh, this is a way that, this person was jaded and, abandoned by society. I feel the same way. Maybe this is a possibility of what I should do. If I find similarity within this person or empathy within this person or something, I am that much more likely to see his course as my course, possibly, in an increased chance, let's say. But that's the incredible darkness that I find, that news keeps reporting certain things. I keep finding those things have an uptick. And there's also, I notice within my country, that we don't report those things as much. Whether that's just certain negative, horrible atrocities. It's not that they don't happen, it's just that seemingly there's a causality between that and the things happening themselves. Or at least people thinking that that is now a possibility to do. How to say no for social proof. So basically social proof is like an automatic response. When you don't know what to do, you kind of you look to your environment to kind of be your guide. Look to your people, your social circumstances to be your guide in this situation. And we're usually taught, by the way, to do this because we have mothers, parents, teachers who are guiding us, and that's usually a good idea to see what everybody else is doing and do the same thing, just for survival's sense. But think of social proof and this concept as like you obfuscating stuff to your autopilot. And sometimes autopilot is amazing. You need it, you gotta have it again, otherwise you'll basically be considering everything and overthinking everything. You need to eventually trust in others' perception and stuff like that. When you recognize a piece of inaccurate data being used, i.e. laugh tracks, stuff like that, whether it's like, oh, I'm considering, somebody else takes responsibility out of this, what do I have to lose to phone the police if another person's phoned the police already? Nothing really, I'll do it, So inaccurate data. So when somebody is basically flushing the environment with non-useful data. Oh, also, but did I mention, by the way, they did a bunch of tests that showed when, if there's basically a person screaming and saying he has a seizure or something, or he's having a stroke, but they basically hired a bunch of researchers to pretend like nothing was going on, just go about business as usual. The people who were not researchers also basically ignored it, which is just even more of a crazy thing with social proof. But I digress. Whenever you see something that is inaccurate data being used, take control. So when you see stuff that doesn't make sense, like laugh tracks, or when something is, just like synthetic data being infused into an environment, take control of the autopilot. If you're ever seen in like a crisis response, take control of the autopilot and say, what do I have to lose here? I could phone the police and say, are we okay? I could sit and watch for a little bit and make sure it's not that, etc. But again, you will sometimes have to obfuscate responsibility just to kind of get through your daily life because you can't consider everything as a possible thing. But whenever you feel like there's a piece of inaccurate data, that's when you grab the fucking alarm or grab the autopilot and take control again. All right, boys, we're going to rush a little bit because I'm taking too much of your time. Frankly, this has to be a part 2, I guess, because golly. Okay, chapter 5, Liking the Friendly Thief. The main work of a trial attorney is to make the jury like their client. This whole thing is based around this principle. The liking rule. We are more persuaded to do the things for someone we like than not like. It talks about all of the ways in which people will use people who you like against you or become a person that you like to use that to be a way that they can basically leverage that liking for their own gain. So one of the things they talk about is Tupperware parties, which is basically just like a bunch of housewives get together and they sell a bunch of Tupperware. Because the housewives invite their friends and the other neighborhood housewives, etc., there is an obligation to be friendly, to buy certain things, and to kind of do that. So they're using like your friendship, etc. Also, there's a great example of a person like phoning them and being like, hey, your friend is on this plan, and if you go to his network, his phone service, you'll be able to save him like $50 in revenue. And your friend seems like he calls you a lot. I think it'd be, if you want to do that, we can go forward with that. Basically using the fact that your friend calls you so much as kind of a bargaining chip to get you to do it. Now, if they said Joe Schmo that phoned you once has this thing, you wouldn't care. But the fact that it's your friend, that you could be helping him, that you could be working with him and doing something nice for him, makes you feel like you're not denying a salesman, but instead denying your friend. So be careful of the liking rule. But regardless, what are the things that make us like people? So one of the things that's really interesting is they're called halo effects, but it's basically when one positive characteristic dominates a way that you perceive somebody. So one of the ways that one of the halo effects is called physical attractiveness. So that's one of the things that have a likeness to us. But basically, we assign good-looking people to have such favorable traits as talent, kindness, honesty, intelligence, and all of these things. Simply put, physically attractive people, they are better liked, more persuasive, and more frequently helped, and seen as personal traits and having greater intelligence and all of these things. Because we like attractive people, and we tend to comply with the people we like. And it's funny because in every single instance that this was shown, people perceive themselves having less of a draw. This is kind of the overarching thing of the book, but most people would perceive themselves as like, a beautiful woman standing beside like a fast car. That doesn't make the car seem better or seem more interesting or better. That wouldn't work on me, but yet when they do tests of this, absolutely that does work. It's a passive effect. Also, within like Congress people, within like politicians, people who are kind of physically attractive seemingly are just better liked in general. People will rate them on like a likelihood of that. And yes, so attractiveness, even things like intelligence and all these other things, physical attractiveness. And I don't even think it means like sexiness or anything like that. I think it means just good bone structure, people who genuinely you like the composition of them, etc. Those people are generally perceived to have better values than normal people. But it's also interesting that most people perceive themselves as less of having that effect on them. Like, I wouldn't fall for it, but it seems like passively we do. But also, this is the other thing, similarity. So what causes liking within others? Having a person who is similar to us. So that doesn't just mean in clothes, although it can mean. It means in clothes, it means in hobbies, it means in interests, it means in like style, clothes. It means in a slew of things. So a lot of salesmen will be like, I see, like they'll train to look for things, whether that's like, you like that too. Like they'll prod you for your likes and interests and then mimic those said likes and interests to an extent in which is usually like a surface level interest, which is like, I know I go play golf too sometimes. I can't wait. Or they'll see like a baseball glove in the back of the car and they'll be like, are you into that? And it's like, no, my son is. And it's like, I have a son too, and he's just getting into Little League. And again, you'll have this, we like people that are similar to us. And that can go for like, what do you call it? Like culture, not even just like like a person who is considered to be an American, there's a higher probability that you would help someone who you could guarantee being American than a person who is a foreigner who's from another place, which sounds kind of weird. I'm Canadian, but just the point to be that similarity plays a big role. Okay. Another thing that's pretty easy to understand: compliments. Compliments also affect liking. The funniest thing about this, though, is that it was, as long as the compliment is not seen as manipulative, which means obvious that the other person has something to gain. So if I said, "You look great, would you mind buying this thing?" That's seen as like, okay, no, that was this, and now you're wanting me to get this. But the funny thing about compliments, though, is it also said that we like compliments, or like people that give compliments, even if they don't have any ground. So even if they don't make sense. If I said, "Oh my God, you have such beautiful eyes," and you had my eyes, just fucking dark, just basically like olives, black olives, boom. I would be like, "Oh, it's so nice," despite I know it has no ground, but I'm just like, "That's a nice thing to say," etc. That's also the idea that we like people who like us. So when someone says, "I'm going to give you a compliment," they're like seeming like they're liking you, and therefore, yeah. But it's funny because the compliment doesn't need to make sense, but it does. It can't be right by the thing. So you have to like say a bunch of compliments, give a break period. It seems like within the sales strategy, and then you'd ask someone if they're interested in buying something, you know? Okay, so the last one in regards to liking, how do we like people in terms of the psychological aspect of, like, you know, psychologists, basically their data over the years. One of them is contact and familiarity. So, but both of these seem to be on a measurement of good experiences and bad experience. So if you have a lot of bad contact experiences with something, like say if you see, I don't know, like you're in a horror film and you hear a violin start to have a high pitch, you'll have that response of that specific sound being negative because it's always brought by like a scary thing or a jump scare, negative emotion. Whereas if you see something happy, like some sort of upbeat tone, like a rhythm that you've heard 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways executed, but it usually comes in like a happy-go-lucky kind of like scene, a loving thing, you know, sunset. These are things that we have a lot of contacts of positive. So positive and negative, contact and familiarity are both playing on that spectrum. If you have a lot of familiar, positive memories, you're good. Contact experiences that are also good, you'll be good too. That will mean a positive execution of liking. Yeah, they did a bunch of tests where they showed a bunch of like people in succession. The people that they seen more, when they finally met them, they had a higher probability of liking. Oh, this was the example of solitary children I was talking about. So the contact and familiarity, the fact that these kids were basically like isolated and never had any experience or contact or any sort of familiarity of the possible outcome of like a social engagement going well. The fact that they seen this ad nauseum for 20 minutes with other kids that were similar to them having this experience, it made them empowered to be like, oh, well, this is the same as that video, that film I watched. Okay, so this is actually really interesting, but requires a ton of explanation, so we'll try to be quick. Cooperation. Long story short, if you're trying to bring other groups together, cooperation is significantly better than competition, which goes against how a lot of public schools and just schools in general are formatted, which is this idea of like a teacher asks the class a question, and usually it's like a competition. The first, a bunch of kids hold up their hand and want to get the validation of the teacher. Kids who don't know the answer recede into their chair. And there's could be envy with the key people who recede into the chair, being like, damn it, I wish I had the answer. I feel stupid. I don't like that. That made me feel that way. And there might be some like judgment on the kids who got the answer correct, on like saying, hey, these people are stupid, or these people aren't trying, etc. So one of the things that they talked about in regards to that is the basic, if you want to make people against each other, you basically take two different groups, separate them, and then introduce competition to just rev up hatred, just rev up prejudice and rev up isolation and against the other. And it's funny because the experiments that they did, they basically did this with children in camps and whatnot, and they found that this had the net result of like almost creating Frankenstein. Like they almost didn't know how to put the genie back in the bottle, how to make these kids not hate each other anymore. And they found that the equal to competition and prejudice, something that was going to be the positive in regards to, you know, making people less prejudiced, making people more loving and more caring, how to dissolve your preconceived judgments and notions based on a group or a person, was not competition or just contact, which is basically just put them together and eventually they'll figure it out. It doesn't work that way. What apparently works is cooperation and positive contact. So cooperation, where you both have to succeed, where your ability to move forward is directly in the hands of quote unquote your enemy or your the person you despise. The fact that you're both tied together and you both have to work together, you dissolve those preconceived understandings of like the judgments and the saying that person's not very good or that person's wrong because of this and that. Cooperation seems to bridge the gap of racism and segregation and stuff like that. But it's not just, you can't just say like, oh, we segregated groups of people and now we're going to put them together. It just had a bloody clashing effect. But if you put them together in scenarios in which they both have to work together and they both benefit from working together, then you have them grow together. They want to contribute because they're gaining something from you helping them and them helping you. Conditioning and association, kind of like familiarity and contact, but it's basically consistent exposure to something that is otherwise positive. Same thing can be on a spectrum of positive and negative, etc. This is kind of the idea of bad news infects the teller. Like weatherman will get shit on always and get hated because they're always the bearer of bad news. Their contact or familiarity is always tied to something negative. So most people hate the weatherman, or at least that's been a trope for a while now. Even though people can rationalize, like they don't control the weather, it's just that they're always the bringer of bad news. So people kind of start to hold them responsible, even passively. But the same can be said for positive association. So if you have, if you're positively associated with, you're like a weatherman, but you exist in a place where it's always sunny, people will hold you with benevolence and love. They have a thing within Persian, mythos, where essentially if the messenger had good news in the Persian army and they came back to give good news, they would basically be awarded with money, women, alcohol, etc. A wonderful night. If they were the bearer of bad news, they'd be killed on the spot. So it's the idea that information infects the user, infects the teller. So association and conditioning being this kind of overarching thing to that. How to not get wrecked by the liking principle. Simply put, this is the quick answer to it, which I like. A quick fix is if you take a step back and you are dealing with a salesperson or a person who you're doing with, it's just a good rule of thumb to just separate the person you're buying something from and the product, because you're going to be buying the product and using the product, not buying the person to hang out with whilst it's not good. But you shouldn't resist liking somebody or working with someone who is enjoyable to work with, right? So one of the things that they say is if you ever think you're being manipulated in such a way, you have to ask yourself two questions. One of them is, in the allotted time that I've been given with this person, have I liked them more than I otherwise would have or should have, based on my understanding of caring for people and liking them? I don't know, I was dealing with a salesperson for 20 minutes trying to sell me this car, and yeah, he's kind of charming and fun, and I like him a lot. And you're 20 minutes, and I like him this much. That doesn't really add up. Okay, maybe he's doing something that I don't know about to maybe do that. Doesn't mean I'm not gonna let him I'm gonna stop liking him, but it does mean that I might want to start to do that separation for the person I like to the person I'm buying from. Is the deal actually that good? Actually, not really. I want to work with him because he's a nice person, but that doesn't mean the deal's good. And now there's potential for him to be a person who is basically doing that, trying to make me like him. Okay. And then the last step you need to ask yourself is, what does this person have to gain from me doing this? And that's where they gain a sale and yeah, is this truly the best deal for me? Maybe not really. Maybe you come to the conclusion, yes, actually it is. It's okay for someone to be really charismatic and really likable, and even to do these things with you. If you still get a good deal, then you just got a fun, good experience. But it's when people are trying to sell you something that is bad and trying to leverage, making you like them, making you care for them, that gets, manipulative and corrosive. But yeah, just ask yourself the question, am I liking this person too quickly? Normally I wouldn't like someone this much, and then I'm overnight or 2 seconds I'm in. That doesn't make sense. That's a red flag. So look out for that. Lastly, ladies and gentlemen, no, not lastly. We're gonna really speed up here. Sorry for these last couple chapters because they're brilliant and I should talk more about them. But basically, weapon of influence number 6, chapter 6, is called authority. Now it sucks because this is actually a very, very good thing. But basically, the simple idea of this weapon of influence is, we are taught as children to constantly look to teachers, to our parents, to masters in their field, to be the authority that we're supposed to follow. But we have this kind of automatic response to just not even thinking and just trusting in their good judgment. And we do this with titles and clothes. And anyone who we perceive to be an authority on something. This could also be an expert doctor or an expert in medicine or like this topic. Maybe you're in a store and you're being sold a TV and this guy has convinced you somehow, some way that he really knows his stuff. And you deem him to be an authority. And you want to trust in his wisdom, especially if you have less wisdom yourself about a given topic. And yeah, there's a great crazy study that they did in Harvard. I want to quickly talk about it, but it's basically the teacher and the learner experiment, where basically lots of smoke and mirrors, but they wanted to see what is the extent in which someone is willing to complete their job even at the expense of the suffering of another. So what they did is they got a person tied up who was in the learner role, and basically the teacher was going to ask the learner questions, and every time the learner got a question wrong, he would get a zap in the chair, like zzz, and then the teacher would keep asking questions. So the test went on, and eventually the learner stopped being able to answer questions. He started getting into a panic. He started saying, like, let me out, I'm getting zapped consistently, it's hurting, I have a heart problem, all of these things. And throughout the entire experiment, no one stopped. None of the teachers stopped, but the teachers all showed symptoms of like anxiety, terror, paleness, vomiting. Like they clearly did not like what they were doing, but they continued. And the takeaway was that there was a researcher who was helming this experiment where they obfuscated like responsibility and the choosing to this authoritarian figure. And again, if you guys don't believe that scenario, think about war. How a soldier will go against otherwise his beliefs and identity and all these things if it was an order because he trusts in his commander or whatever, and it's built into their head that you need to trust in your commander above all else, chain of command, all that stuff. Trust in your authority person because he has to make the choices and etc. And you just have to act. So you can obfuscate responsibility to him, and yeah, had to be done, that kind of thing. So it seems like there's no limit that human beings will go to in terms of suffering of others if they determine the other person to be an authority in that environment, or at least a higher probability in that way. Anyways, so that's kind of the idea of authorities and such like that. There's also a subcategory to this, like clothing and titles. So if you think about the insanity of clothing, like if you think about it, if somebody just dressed up in a cop uniform and said, "Hey, can you go over there and like wait?" Would you question it? Like everyone has that thing in their head that says like, "Oh no, I trust in this uniform," when this could easily be manipulated and used in a criminal way. But we all kind of have this automatic response, is like, "Okay, I'll go over there." Like, even though we don't ask for badge numbers or anything like that, and if we do, who the fuck would know what to do with it, kind of thing, Same thing with titles. People will kind of pine for this idea of like professor, and people have this response to it. Again, doctor and nurses have this weird relationship where doctors have like a hierarchy in the hospitals, to where a lot of times nurses will not like go against the doctor's orders even if they know it to be kind of weird, because they just trust, they offload choice to whatever the authority is, even if it compromises sometimes your belief structure. So how do you avoid this authority kind of thing? So how do you say no to this like kind of little voice in your head of authority? You ask yourself these questions: Is this authority truly an expert on something? And also, what does this authority have to gain from telling me this? So if you see there's a complication of interests, then you're like, okay, that seems wrong. I don't. You have something to gain here. I'm gonna look at this. I'm gonna start to slowly again reclaim the wheel, take hold of autopilot, and be like, what's going on? And also, you need to say, is this authority truly an expert on this? You may want to doubt that. And if they prove it, sure. But then you also need to check where their interests are. A lot of times big oil companies or something will hire some sort of scientist to say, hey, say this. You're an expert in this. We're going to use that expertise and like background that you developed over the years for our own gain. We'll pay you a healthy sum. Will you be willing to do this? And they're like, yeah, sure, I guess. If I get set for life, sure. So yeah, you have to ask yourself those questions. And lastly, ladies and gentlemen, the final chapter is called Scarcity, or in my favorite way of saying it, FOMO, fear of missing out. But scarcity is the better way to put it. The rule of the few. But basically, the idea of scarcity is, or the idea of this scarcity principle, that opportunities seem more valuable to us when their availability is limited. So the fewer there are of something, the more we value it. The more unique the item, the fewer there are of it, the more value we give it. Even if that is like a defect, so like a coin that had like a weird press to it, a special dollar bill that had like a sagging eye of George Washington, even if they're mistakes, they become priceless unique artifacts or priceless unique one-of-a-kinds in that way. Same thing can be said for the idea of like scarcity with the perception of people. Specifically, scarcity also can be affected by competition. So there's this idea of like, oh, this has always been a rare commodity, whether that's like, depending on where you live, it could be a type of food, it could be a type of work, it could be a type of whatever. But when you introduce competition into something, it gets really mean really fast. Scarcity increases. Hence like auctions where it's like, you're going against that person, you're fighting against that person. And it creates this kind of like heated irrationality on trying to like win and secure your bid. It's kind of like to take your piece of meat from the hunt kind of idea. Again, there's no greater example of this in the last couple of years than the toilet paper fiasco with COVID. The idea that everybody jumped on this thing as soon as they started seeing like barren toilet paper rows of emptiness, they were like ran at it and they're like, holy shit, I'm not going to be able to get mine. I need to get it. Same thing is basically scarcity will make it so that things that you would otherwise not be as interested is interesting because of its limited nature of it. So like if, oh, this is a once in a lifetime solar eclipse, or this is a once in a lifetime viewing of this show, is trying to manipulate your idea of scarcity of like, oh, well, this is the only time I can acquire this, so I have to act now. Another thing is human beings are way more motivated to act when it comes to being sold losing something or getting damaged by something than to have gained something or to have benefited from something. You are more motivated to act if I tell you how much money you're losing and how much money, therefore, if you were to stop doing these habits that you could save. Say if that telemarketer is phoning you and saying, hey, what do you call it? I represent this company with this service. Based on your phone bills, we see that you're losing $100 a month. With our service, you'd be gaining $100 to spend. But the fear of you losing that much money and then having that much money to back is like, oh, okay. And that may get you to act. Also, if they said this would only take 5 minutes to switch over, they'd be like, oh, okay. And then you'd be like, okay, this is totally worth. But if you were to say like, oh, you could gain this much money every month, like how many people have led with that? Of like, oh, you could gain $100 a month with this service. You're like, this seems like a scam, you know? Because I'm just no. So, but yeah, the point is that when you have something to gain, you act less than if you had something to lose. So we are motivated by loss of time, loss of availability, loss of the fear of pain. Also, we're not too motivated by the gain of certain things. Another thing that they do with modern day scarcity is this idea of hey, just to tell you, there's actually the meat that you're buying. We're actually running low on it. People keep buying it like crazy. I thought I'd let you know if you wanted to stock up because we're not sure if we're going to have enough supply for next week. You're like, okay, and then you'd buy up. And it doesn't need to be true or not. You can't even prove if it's true or not, but people will use that as a tactic to get you to act and to move. Okay, so this is really cool. Psychological reactance. But basically, that whole big word is referring to this kind of thing where humans respond to diminishing personal controls. Or, as the opportunities become less available, we lose freedoms. And we hate losing freedoms. So the idea is, this kind of plays to this idea called the Romeo and Juliet effect. But when we start to lose freedoms, or when we start to lose opportunities that we otherwise had at one point, we don't want to lose those opportunities. We don't want to lose that thing that we've had, that freedom, that flourishing of an economy, whatever it could be. So when that takes place, there's something called the Romeo and Juliet effect that kind of has a similar tinge to it. But when we start to lose freedoms, we have all the more reason to like hold on to those freedoms and to not let them lose them and things like that. So when we start to lose something, we have all the more reason to grab onto it. And there's a thing called the Romeo and Juliet effect, which is basically referring to the story of Romeo and Juliet and how fast they became romantically in love with each other, and the causality that psychologists who read the play basically refer to their parents being the issue, where their parents, because they said you can't be with that person, there's no way they could do this, that restriction and that command and like demand of them acting in a certain way makes the freedom that they usually had outside of a person's age or etc. Like another thing is that a reader report at the very end of the chapter talks about a girl who went on one date with an older man, and her parents like got really mad and started like saying you can't do that, and all it did was incentivize her to want to go on more dates with that person. Almost as like, don't try to take my freedom away from me, but also it makes you value the freedom that was being lost. So the thing that like, oh, I'm not able to go out with older men or whatever in this girl's case, it made it even more valuable to her perception, because that was trying to be taken away. So that thing became even more valued because it was in question of being taken away. So you cling to that freedom. Whatever that thing is that's going away, you value even more. It's kind of like a boon that is being pulled away from you. And that's kind of the overarching thing of like, when you lose freedoms and when you lose certain things, they only become more attractive. So when you try to suppress information, all it does is make that information more valid. It's kind of where censorship kind of falls apart, is when you censor things, you only make the censored information more credible and more valuable. And people, they even referred to maybe the forefathers of America not having the freedom of speech thing as an act of openness, but instead an act of kind of psychology of like saying no. But the more you try to suppress information, the more that information is valued, which is kind of evident, I think, in a lot of cases. So how do you say no? Well, the person in the book says, whenever you're confronted with the scarcity pressure surrounding an item, we must also confront the question, what is it we want from the item? If the answer is that we want the thing for the social, economic, and physical benefit of the possession of something's rarity, then fine. But very often we don't want the thing purely for the sake of owning it, of like having this unique item. We want it to do a thing, to have a value, to have a use. So if its value is over the amount of that usefulness, then you're operating under this idea of having something that you want because others want it, and not because it serves a use for you that you could use. But if you want it because of the benefits of psychological economy, like whatever the reason is for you carrying this rare item, but if it exceeds what its value is just because of time, like an example they give in the book as well is that this guy, he's basically there's a church that he can go explore, once in a lifetime kind of opening for this church that otherwise isn't open. He finds himself wanting to act and go look in this church, but if he thinks about it, he doesn't actually care about the church. The only thing that is incentivizing him to want to go see it is the fact that it's a limited time thing. He doesn't actually care about what's inside of it. He just wanted to do it because it was fleeting. And you have to ask yourself the same questions. Do I want this because it gives me a value, and is the value that it gives worth it? Or is it worth it because others value it, not because I value it? And if others value it and I'm using it because I want to leverage that value for more monetary gain, for maybe some sort of social points, sure. But if not, then this is all like taking control of the helm at this point. But ladies and gentlemen, that is all I can kind of talk about with the book. I've already talked to you guys plenty about it. It's frankly too long. But thank you so much for hearing me ramble. This was an amazing book. I loved it to bits. I still have to review it a little bit to kind of cement everything into memory. But it was very, very good and very, very helpful. One of the things I like about it is it helps you kind of have a baseline defense against a lot of these kind of things that I see even more nowadays. This book is old as hell, but I see it everywhere. These kind of tactics and strategies. And if the question for you guys, from you guys, is why are you reading this book, and what compelled you to read it? I should have said it at the beginning, but the reason why I wanted to read it is because to me, I wanted to understand the factors that encompass how people react to things, and if there is a way to utilize those things without actually being negative. Like, that's the thing that kind of has this overarching theme in the book, is it's not that any of these are exactly bad. It's when somebody utilizes them to get you to act when otherwise you wouldn't want to, or when otherwise there's a bad deal. So if I got you to do something that you didn't want to do and you lost something even doing it, then that's a problem. That's manipulative and that's reductive to you. But if I just got better at making you guys feel more entertained, being able to format something in a better way, so that you felt happier watching it, that I was able to make it so that you guys would want to engage in a certain way without like making it so that it's clearly like, again, I'm like convincing you guys to do something what would otherwise go against your interests, then I don't want that. So it's almost like, is there a way to understand how to make somebody happy and how to make somebody want to do something for you, but to not compromise their beliefs and their ideas, and they're like kind of and giving them a bad deal. Essentially, it's like, how do I give someone a good deal and make someone feel better about taking that deal? This is kind of the book to me that kind of helps with make that make sense. And also, again, I'm talking to you guys about it because I don't want, if you ever see me do something in this regard, I don't know how exactly it translates, but it is interesting in some of them. But it to me is more of like okay, some of the things make sense, like the contrast principle of like, okay, when you do one thing, it kind of helps. And I see a bunch of other people use these to a much more manipulative extent. I'm not sure if I'm going to go that deep at all, but I do think it's interesting, even just for the protection aspect of it, which is why I think a lot of you guys should read it too, of keeping yourself safe and not being manipulated in ways that you maybe otherwise wouldn't want to. But granted, none of these are innately bad. It's just can be used in such a way that is bad because it's a kind of an automatic response within all of us. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. Sorry if I look tired. It's been a long day, and I didn't want to miss anything. If you're watching this me in the future, hopefully you recapped it enough, and hopefully you take some of the values learned in the book and do good with them, and don't do bad. Thank you so much for your time. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you guys for listening to me ramble, and goodbye, my friends.